Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today, coming back once again, is Professor Jacques Berlinerblau. Jacques, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jacques Berlinerblau of Georgetown University. Hi, everybody.
Thanks for coming back on. And you are also the author of a book that will be the main topic of our conversation, the Philip Roth, We Don't Know, Sex, Race, and Autobiography, which just published a couple weeks ago.
5 days ago, 6 days ago.
So congratulations on the book. And so our previous conversation, we talked about some of the themes that you explore in this book, and we'll link to that previous conversation. So we're mostly talking about a excerpt of the book that ran in Salon, I think, and was focused on the racial analysis of how Philip Roth treated African-American characters in his books. So maybe we won't cover that part as much because we sort of covered some of that already. But, and as we briefly discussed before recording, when we taped, it was 2 or 3 weeks before the Blake Bailey biography published, biography of Roth published. And very quickly after that, all these accusations came out that Bailey himself was had sexually assaulted various women in his life, and the book was pulled by the publisher, and it was a huge, bizarre mess. And so I remember when I re-listened to our conversation, and neither of us had read the Bailey biography at that point, and we were sort of talking about a little bit about the reviews and saying, "Oh, this is going to be a big thing." And of course, we didn't know that it was going to become this giant, cultural disaster or whatever. So, but maybe we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end, because people are going to be talking about Philip Roth this year anyway, but it assumed a level that most people couldn't have predicted. Okay, so the book, you start right off with MeToo and how the MeToo movement changed, or possibly changed, how people might view a writer like Philip Roth. Can you talk about that? And is that really what inspired this work?
Yeah, a couple of things inspired it. Let's start with Me Too, because it's so important. And once again, thank you for having me back. I really enjoyed these conversations. You're a fun person to just speak with.
Thank you.
So with Me Too, what I was noticing in the course of the research is, so Me Too launches, as it were, in October 2017. It becomes this viralizing phenomenon. And within 6 months, as Me Too branches out into the arts, and many of the most ostentatious offenders were males in the arts, straight males in the arts, and then later they were gay males in the arts, and then later there were some women, very few though. I noticed that Roth's name, Aryeh, kept popping up. Like, that's interesting. So I was in media res. I was kind of in the middle of my project when I noticed that. So there were all these retrospective pieces, Philip Roth and Me Too, right? The hashtag Me Too moment speaks to Philip Roth. And it was all good, but I was trying to say to myself, well, wait, is there an accusation? Has he been accused of anything that we would associate with the hashtag Me Too movement? And I couldn't think of one that actually got there, though he came pretty close with the Claire Bloom memoir, Leaving a Doll's House. So the question I wanted to ask is, to quote Max Weber, what is this elective affinity between conversations about Me Too and Philip Roth? Why do they keep going together when this author has not technically been accused of any typical Me Too crimes? And what I started to realize as I was reading Me Too theorists, I don't know if we can call them that, but the writers that were thinking about art in the aftermath of October 2017, is there's actually a lot of similarity between the way hashtag Me Too theorists think about art and Philip Roth thinks about art. And that was a big surprise. Doesn't mean they agree, but in terms of abstract categories, ways of conceptualizing what happens in a work of art, the same moves are being made. And that helped me understand why these two were always being linked in popular discourse. So I'll stop there and I'll let you redirect me.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so a key part of that would be the connection between the artist and the art, which is a debate, that goes back a long time and will never be, we'll never have a final settlement of it, I think. But that was a huge that's a huge theme in Roth's work, and also became part of the Me Too narrative, I guess, in sort of a, well, I don't know. I mean, the most obvious way would be a performer or actor or writer or something who had some piece of work that was like about to come out and it was withdrawn. And so that happened to Louis C.K. He had this movie that was like weeks from being released, and then it was effectively canceled. And so, and then you get into someone who maybe committed a violation 10 years ago, and then they have reading their old work, or maybe they committed a violation 50 years ago and they're no longer alive. What does it mean to consume their work now? And so part of that, part of it gets mixed up with just like, should like people who we know are bad people get paid money for their creations when they are bad? And that's sort of maybe the simplest form of it, of someone saying, well, I'm never going to see a Woody Allen movie again, even though Woody Allen has not been convicted of anything in a court of law. In the court of public opinion, he's probably guilty, and people, I think, it's totally fine to say, yeah, I'm sick of Woody Allen for whatever reason.
Woody Allen hasn't been convicted in a court of law, but there is a tremendous body of evidence, far more than Roth. I'm not trying to defend Roth, right? But as you know, reading my book, I'm very critical of my hero, as I should be, being a scholar, right?
Right.
But there's nothing like that in Roth's background. But there is.
So nothing. Yeah, and you would think, well, I don't know. I mean, and this, we're moving towards talking, maybe having to mention the Blake biography. If there was a group of people who had, I mean, this is so complicated. Often with these cases, it was it wasn't a one-time offense, and there's multiple accusers, and that's the case with Cosby and Weinstein and CK, etc. Not always the case, but so you would think if Roth had committed a transgression that we now see as a true violation or a crime, it probably would have been habitual, and it probably would have come out at this point. And the fact that it hasn't, obviously, it'll never be like he's dead, so it'll never be proven in a court of law. And so that there'll always be some level of ambiguity, but it does seem like, despite the fact that he wrote about many men who were the type of people who would be taken down by Me Too, in his personal life, he was not that, but he conflated his fictional characters with his actual real life identity so much. And there's even a part of the book where you question whether we can even be said to have a real life identity, or whether the self even exists. We'll maybe discuss that a little bit also. So I'm kind of rambling here, but yeah. So it's I don't know. I'm at this point, I'm not ready to give Philip Roth the pass of saying, well, he obviously never did anything truly bad in his life, or we would have learned about it by now, because who knows what'll come out tomorrow. Maybe Blake Bailey burned some documents because he seems to be a sociopath. There's all this, but talking about how Roth understood his fiction and his fiction, and how feminist critics understand after Me Too, understand the connection between the artist and the art. That is very interesting. And so, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. All right. So let's talk about that, right? What I think hashtag Me Too at its finest, and I call it the Me Too school, but it's not really a school. It's just various writers that kind of coalesce right around the theme. At its best, what the school says is we really cannot disarticulate or pry apart the artist from the art, right? They don't say, and cancel the sons of bitches. I've never read that in the writers that I'm citing in my book. I'm sure it's said by some who affiliate with the movement, right? But they're not about cancellation. And I think that's where things get murky and people get all defensive. Oh, they just want to cancel Philip Roth. They just want to. No, they're saying once we acknowledge that there is no wall separating the artist from the art, this is a demand for much greater reflection about the artwork itself, about the victims, right? About the perpetrator who might have been a victim. And I mentioned Michael Jackson as an example of a perpetrator who was likely a victim in his youth. And I think what they're asking us for is a much more deep and profound engagement with what the work of art is. And if Philip Milton Roth is listening to us right now, Aryeh, of blessed memory, he's like, right on, Jacques. I've been trying to do that. I was trying to do that for 60 years, right? So much of his art was trying to get us to understand the saga or the drama or the road that the artist takes to get the work of art produced. And his artists are always saying dumb things like, well, the art is over here, right? And life is over here. They're totally separate. What could be clearer than that? Says Nathan Zuckerman in the anatomy lesson. But if you know your anatomy lesson, by the end, you realize everything is completely jumbled to the point where you don't even know if the anatomy lesson is a work of art, right? You can't tell what it is, right? I love that about Philip Roth. He creates these self-denying artifacts, right? He creates these things that look like novels, but you don't really know what they are. So both MeToo and Philip Roth agree about this fundamental premise that the art and the artist cannot be disarticulated or separated from one another. Their ethical investments, as I point out, are very different, right? Roth has a different understanding of what that means. But it was that similarity which I thought was kind of cool. And I wanted to follow that. I want to say, well, MeToo is licensing me to ask this question and proceed as if the answer is yes. Yes, Philip Milton Roth grafted his life, and this is where it gets tricky, are you ready? And the life of women with whom he was romantically involved into his fiction. Once we acknowledge that's possible, I think we start having a very different conversation about Philip Roth's art, his aesthetics, what he was after, who he was, his failures and his successes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you note in the book, Roth, in his, if he was being interviewed or something, he often would bristle at being termed even like a Jewish American writer. He'd just say, like, I'm an American writer, even though virtually all of his main characters are Jewish men in the creative field who were born in Newark in the early 1930s, matching his biography. And so it's unclear, I think, he obviously liked sort of messing with people, and it's unclear whether he did that as just another way of trolling, essentially, in modern parlance, or he did somehow believe something that seemed obviously false, that like his characters were not avatars in some sense of himself. So that I don't know if we'll find an answer.
But he trolled a lot. I mean, so on the Jewish, I wrote a piece for this forthcoming Cambridge volume edited by Madeline McKinney about, was Roth a Jewish American writer? And I line up all the times he said, no, you moron, I'm not a Jewish American. Like really truculent in the face of people, like, sandblasting them with anger, right? Like, how could they be so dumb, right? So I just did a graph of how many of his novels, maybe we'll put it up at the end. Like, I just did like a little bar graph. How many of his novels had an X-rated level of Jewish content, a Holocaust, references to State of Israel, anti-Semitism. It's like, it's like 3/4 of them, right? From the beginning to the end. So why did Roth deny these things? I'm going to make a quick cut, which might interest you. Roth, in a way, aimed to obliterate the critic. All right. And I think what's happening in my book as I read it again is there's this war going on between the critic and the artist. Right. And critics and artists are very different people. And we are subservient to them. And we are secondary to them. And we're not as great or as brilliant or as cool as them. But we're fucking critics, right? It's our job to understand the art form and what's happening. And as I look at Roth's career, he had very little patience for skilled critics that might disagree. There were a lot of skilled critics that loved him, justifiably. He's a great writer, right? So when Hermione Lee writes about Philip Roth, he gets into a great conversation with her because she's a wonderful critic, and she happened to like most of what when skilled critics that were critical of his work got on his case, and I would refer to certain reviewers for the New York Times, right? Roth just descended into these infantile rants and ways of caricaturing them in his own fiction. There it goes again, right?
And I think you don't explicitly note this, but I had totally forgotten that like a villain character in Sabbath Theater is last name Kakatani.
Yep.
I mean, I assume Kakatani reviewed Sabbath Theater. I don't know if she said anything about that in particular, but like, yeah, he likes thumbing his nose at various groups, and one would definitely be his critics. And I think he always was saying, just a fuck you, or like, you don't understand me.
But could he have done that without the whole Japanese-American anti-Asian stuff? I mean, right, so the Kakutani, he keeps mispronouncing the name and miswriting it in Sabbath Theater. Ha, 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 can't right? There's a lot of, like, anti-Japanese rage in there. All right, I get it. His brother was killed in World War II and was shot down, right?
This is Mickey Sabbath's brother, not...
This is Sabbath Theater. Yeah. But... I mean, there are ways of doing this and there are ways of doing this, right? Did he have to, excoriate Irving Howe to the degree that he did by making him into the pornographer Milton Apple in the anatomy lesson, right? So, I mean, we're sitting here. It's funny. We haven't even asked the question. We have like a dozen examples of Roth importing people and events from his life into his fiction, right? And this son of a gun was constantly denying it and getting mad at people and saying they didn't understand what art was. They didn't understand what fiction was. How dare they assume that anything he wrote was not the sovereign product of his fecund imagination.
Right.
And it's absurd. So what critics have to do is we have to be critical. And if you look at some of the things I say in the book, the critical apparatus failed with Philip Roth, right? It gave in to Philip Roth, right? Philip Roth mastered the critical apparatus. And I think there's a little of that with the official biographer as well, right? The official biographer was handpicked, right? The official biographer was the recipient, I feel, maybe of perks and benefits of the doubt that others might not have received. And what we got was a huge, huge scandal, which is not good for Roth studies, by the way, all right? Those who wanted to bury Roth now have another reason to bury Roth, and that's a minor tragedy from all of this. There are a lot of major tragedies from this whole episode, but it's a minor tragedy. It's not good for Philip Roth's posterity.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about what you mentioned about Roth bringing people from his life into his fiction, even if he denied it. I think so he's gone. He can no longer object in this world. So but it seemed pretty obvious that he used people in his life and versions of them appeared in his fiction, and often they were not so nice versions of them, or caricatures or total like grotesques versions of people in his life, especially women who he had romantic relationships with that ended badly. And the main one is his first wife. What is her name? Maggie Martinson?
Margaret Martinson Williams.
Okay. Margaret Martinson Williams, who he had a very bizarre relationship with, and who they married, they divorced, and she died in a car accident in the late 1960s, but continued to haunt Roth and his novels for a long time thereafter. There's at least like 6 or so characters you could say are some version of this woman. And in my conversation that I had with Laura Marsh from the New Republic after the Bailey story broke, she noted how it seemed like in the biography, Bailey and Roth were working in lockstep to portray her as a human monster and disgusting in every possible way, and so now we have to wonder how this first official draft of history that was written, how accurate that is. But anyway, and so am I reading you correctly to think that you see it as some form of a violation that the MeToo movement has exposed to us, that Roth took people from his life and without their permission, and maybe they were after they were dead, but they may have been living, had a fictional version of them appear in his books and often portrayed very badly. Is this like an ethical?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. So, as always with Roth, because he's so smart and he's always ahead of the game, right? Roth in his fiction has characters complaining about being fictionalized by Nathan Zuckerman, right? So they're reading about themselves. Think of Henry Zuckerman in The Counterlife, right? And he's saying, that bastard, that cannibal, did he completely lack a conscience? Did he know what he could have done to my life if anyone read it? Maria Zuckerman makes the same complaint. So we're in this like meta loop where we have no idea where we're standing with Roth. And I don't think he quite, that's the question I'm really interested in. Did he like sometimes not know where he was, right? What dimension he inhabited? That'd be so cool, right? If we learn that about Philip Roth. Ethically, it's a bad practice. I think a friend of mine put me in one of his novels, a former friend, right? And I'm not recognizable and I'm not a famous person, so it doesn't matter. But I felt really violated. I did not like it one bit. And it's nothing. It's just some certain characters and oddities of the Berlinerblau persona. All right. Imagine you're the ghost of Margaret Martinson Williams. What did I count? 10? 10 times he brought her back into a novel for another drubbing. All right. So at some point, the fact that she can't even respond, that's part of it, right? Those who do respond, Claire Bloom, all right, who found herself likely parodied in I Married a Communist, right, really felt a sense of betrayal, which is one of the great Rothian themes, and outrage at having been traduced by Philip Milton Roth. In the Library of Congress, I realized this went back very early, right? So 1959, I found a letter from, I forget, is it Gorofsky or Grofsky, who is the model for Brenda Potemkin. And the Grofsky lawyers are saying to Roth, do not publish this. You have traduced her. We will take very badly to you publishing this story. But he did it anyhow. Somebody like Ira Nadel, a wonderful Roth scholar, would be able to tell us how it all came together. But Roth had a habit of taking the intimate, romantic, sexual, interpersonal details of his relationships and putting them into his fiction. And it's not as if these women are made out to be these like sterling, until maybe like the Counterlife with Maria Zuckerman. It's often very negative, right? And it's often very sexist, and it's often very misogynist, right? And this is why I think those Me Too bells went off, right? Looking at these depictions, especially in the 70s, in My Life as a Man, for example, right? You had feminist critics, I think of Vivian Gornick, right, who would say, what is this? What's going on here? And I think what Vivian Gornick in her criticisms of Roth understood is, no way, this ain't fiction, man. I think she got that. I don't think she said it, but I think this is way too close, right, to be just fiction. He's doing something creepy here. He's doing something seedy. He's taking women he knew and he's putting them on the page, and they can't talk back. They're not winning the battle, right? There's no self-criticism. It's just an excoriation. And sure, is it legal? Yeah, it's legal, I guess, right? You can't defame the dead. Is it ethical? Absolutely not. But, you know, art isn't ethical. The name of my first chapter is Art is Slimy. So I study a slimy thing, right? And you enjoy and talk to people who study or create slimy things. So here we are, all slimy, groaning together.
Okay, so my reaction to this is, well, first I may mention this in the last time we talked. I heard when I was in high school and before I even knew who Philip Roth was, that the actual Brenda Potemkin grew up in my town, South Orange, New Jersey, and that and so that was sort of like a local trivia point, that the real Brenda Potemkin lived in a sort of Jewish neighborhood called Newstead in South Orange, New Jersey. And there's probably a dozen or so women, at least over the years, who claim to be the actual Brenda Potemkin.
That's so funny.
And so it's impossible to know who it actually is. I think I actually, and then, so who knows? So it's funny that, at one point there was a threatened lawsuit by someone who claimed they were being defamed, and probably there's a dozen different women who whisper to their grandkids, I was the actual Brenda Potemkin. I asked the lifeguard to hold my glasses. And
it's Maxine Grofsky. That's okay. Who we're almost Groffsky. Please continue. This is very entertaining.
Yeah. So I mean, but that's just sort of a silly aspect of it. But also, did you pay any attention to this mini controversy around an article that Slate published a couple months ago about the Cat Person short story? Does this catch your eye?
Refresh my memory, though.
Okay,
yes,
so Cat Person, just for people who don't remember this, Cat Person, a short story published in the New Yorker. It was like the first and maybe only viral short story where it captured the discourse for like a week. And it's fiction, but people, it seems so realist that some people thought it was like actually a personal essay. Maybe there's people who don't usually read short stories. People were talking about it, and it was narrated by a woman who's a college student, and she has an uncomfortable romantic encounter with an older man, And it sort of sparked a conversation about like gray rape, because the woman never says no, but she's very uncomfortable, and it's all from her perspective. And you really, it's sort of extremely well done. The writer's name is Rupenian, I think, and she immediately got like a book contract off of this, and and the reverberations are still being felt. So then, just a couple months ago, Slate published this piece written by a woman saying that the plot of Cat Person was taken from my life, and we'll include the link to this. It sort of baffled me. I still don't know quite what to think about it. But this woman claimed, and persuasively, that key details in the short story were taken from her life because she knew people who knew Rupenian, and like they were students. Like Rupenian was like a grad student while this woman was an undergrad, and somehow the story got around of a relationship with a guy in his 30s, and there wasn't like a sexual assault. It just was like a relationship that ended, but she saw herself transmogrified into a fictional character, and certain key details, and like people were texting her being like, did you like, have you read this story? Like, I think this is you. And she was like, what are you talking about? And so it seems, so from this woman's perspective, is like a totally bizarre thing that happened. It is like something out of a Philip Roth or Woody Allen story of mixing reality and fiction and who knows what. And so a lot of people were thinking, like, is there an ethical violation that happened here? Obviously, this woman went through a bizarre episode, but like, did Rupenian, what should she have done? And I kind of ended up thinking she should have changed a couple more details, like this woman's hometown, or there were other specific details that were included that could have obviously been changed without sort of exposing this real person to, whatever. But in the end, it was sort of like, what is the poor fiction writer supposed to do? I mean, you can create people out of whole cloth. You can write stories about aliens and wizards and goblins and stuff like this, or you can like look at real life and sort of bring it all in. And so, if I were a novelist and I wrote a novel about my parents or parents that somehow resembled my parents, and would people would people be mad at me? That, I mean, I didn't pick them, so it's a little bit different than with a writing about a former romantic partner. But especially, I don't know, if you had a relationship with Philip Roth after 1969, you sort of had to know that he might end up writing some version of you into his novels. And so I sort of questioned whether this was something that we can say is, I agree, like art is messy and we shouldn't like put it up on a pinnacle all the time or ever maybe, but like what else is the writer supposed to do besides?
Yeah, what are they supposed to do? No,
from real life.
I thought about. I mean, Roth was not. He was not in any way unaware of the ethical problem. Right? He knew this was an ethical problem. Right? He wrote about it in his fiction, and he kind of gave fictionalists this romantic hall pass. Right? They had a license to cannibalize. They had a license to be shameless. Right? Because that's what the artist has to do, right? The artist has to transgress in order to tell the truth. Now, this to me is much more interesting a line of defense than some of the other lines of defense that Roth might offer for traducing these women into his work, right? So if he's saying, I am ready to suffer the consequences so that through my art, I can tell you something that's very, very true. I can speak the unspeakable. And let's recall, Aryeh, that's a major Roth project, right? And this is why Roth was, and to a certain degree, is a hero still to me, right? He wanted to speak the unspeakable. He wanted to say in fiction what economics can't say, what politics can't say, what the pharmaceutical industry can't say, right? And that is a noble venture, right? It got he kind of divagated, right? He went off the path big time. But what Roth is always trying to do, or frequently trying to do, is he's trying to tap into something very true and very raw that can't be said. And he's trying to put it in beautiful prose so that you can say, oh, God, I never thought of that before. That's a really interesting perspective. Nobody ever alerted me to that. So he's trying to show us something. His mechanism for doing it is weird, right? It's like those paintings, what is it called? Hyperrealism, the paintings that are made to look like a photograph, right? Mm-hmm. He's often just taking actual events from real life And through his alchemy, and he's a wonderful writer, he's kind of splaying them on the page and he's amping them up a little bit and daubing them here and there. But fundamentally, the events are true. Let's go back to the Me Too thing for a moment. If these events are actually true, and if they've actually happened to somebody like Philip Milton Roth, yeah, then he would be subject to some pretty serious #MeToo inquiries, don't you think? Right? Sabbath's Theater and My Life as a Man, final chapter of Portnoy's complaint. All right, I can name about 5 or 6 novels where there's a bucket full of incidents, right, where a #MeToo litigator, if there were such a thing, would say, well, I need witnesses here, right? Given that this guy writes so autobiographically, I want to know if this actually happened, right? If a crime was actually committed. So Roth has passed. We're never going to figure a lot of this stuff out. But it really is a searing question. And I feel when many types of feminist readers read Roth, that's the question they're asking. Unlike his older graying audience of mostly men, but not only men, right, who kind of grew up in the post-World War II liberal consensus, they're not asking those questions as they read. And as I point out very clearly in my book, my students are not vibing with Philip Roth. This generation of students has a lot of problems with him. And I find a lot of my work, believe it or not, is defending him and saying, okay, guys, let's look at this beautiful passage here. All right. Let's think that maybe Roth is trying to light up misogyny, right, and show how awful a thing it is in Indignation, which I think he's doing with the character of Olivia Hutton. So I'm finding my work in the classroom being much more defensive, right? When I do research and I publish, I have no need to defend him, right? But for purposes of getting my students to understand how literature works, right, and what fiction is, I can't have them hating the author from day one, right? If they're just scowling in class and, they're reading him reluctantly and crying as they read him, we're going to get nowhere. So I've got to meet them halfway, and I've got to show them what's sublime about this writer. And there's a lot that's sublime about this writer. I want to stress this, Aryeh, right? Because a lot of people are like, oh, Berlinerblau, he's just a hater. No, there's great stuff about Philip Roth, right? And I'd like to preserve that stuff, but I don't want to do so as some type of lackey or sycophant, right? I want to acknowledge what the problems are because he taught me to do that. Right? He was the one who taught us to keep it real, right? And never put your intellect in the service of a political program or an ideology, right? That's what critics are supposed to do. And I think Roth kind of forgot that at certain points, but okay, he can't be perfect.
Yeah. And, I would guess most novelists are not a huge fan of critics. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't speculate, but it's a naturally antagonistic relationship. Mm-hmm. And, it's possible that in 50 years, people will Roth will just fall out of favor for whatever reason. I'm thinking of that guy, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, James Gould Cousins, who was like a very popular writer, won the Pulitzer Prize, and then no one reads him today. It's just like things change. No one reads William Galsworthy anymore.
Can I jump in? Because you said something really interesting, right? Like about critics and artists, right? Something has changed. We now live in the digital age. Everyone is a critic.
Right.
Right. So there used to be it wasn't like Germany, but you had credentialed critics. Like I understand in Germany, you need a license to be a butcher, a bus driver, a soccer coach, right? You need licenses. There were critics in the 90s and the aughts who spent their life doing criticism. There are scholars, right? We are credentialed. I don't know if we're licensed. And now in the social media age, everyone is a critic.
Right.
So it's even more devastating for the critical apparatus, right? It's not good for the writers either. And I want to second something you said that writers don't like critics, but you know what? Damn it, they need us, right? I really do think they need us. And you're also correct that it gets especially truculent with writers and their critics. Think of that Beck book by Updike, where he murders his critic. He sneaks in like a Batman outfit, right? And the guy's got an emphysema tank and, and he's like dying anyhow. The guy just, right? God, is that funny, right? So I don't think there's much, there shouldn't be, right? We are the regulatory mechanism, right? If there were such a thing, right? We're the sort of overseers and we don't get the glory and we don't deserve the glory, right? But what we do is important because we teach to the next generation. And Roth had so little sympathy or empathy or respect for the craft that, I should have called the book, Aryeh, the revenge of the critic, or the critic strikes back. That's what
right. I mean, it's, like thinking over the long term, the artist creates, and then the critic critiques and analyzes, and then the critics sort of decide who are the artists that continue to be read. But like, people generally are not reading the critics from 100 years ago or 50 years ago. Like, there's some critics who are such good writers that people continue to read them, but it's sort of like there's some sort of societal sorting mechanism such that things rise. And Moby Dick, which was, people didn't like it during its first 50 years or whatever, it sort of rises, but like, people are probably not reading the criticism from like 1855 or 1910, either the original negative reviews or the Renaissance age of Melville, to think about it. Like, there's always new critics coming, and there's not as many new Melvilles writing new masterpieces, I guess, is part of it. But okay, let's move on to the talking a little bit more about misogyny in Roth. And you have a tripartite structure in which you analyze his misogyny, and you'll know the labels and different levels of this. But I mean, that the most obvious charge, and we talked about this last time, is not Philip Roth racist or Philip Roth, unethical stealer of other people's biographies. It's just like, this guy hates women, and the characters hate women, and probably Philip Roth, the author, hates women also. So why should we give him the time of day? So what do you think about that?
All right. So what I did, as you alluded to, and thank you for reading carefully, as I said, let me start this way. I was speaking to a colleague of mine. I'll mention his name because he just told me that he had reviewed my book. And so it's important that we didn't speak while he was reviewing it. But he said, I reviewed your book. I liked it. And he mentioned something which I think is really interesting. He said, Roth is unbiographable. Right. Unphotographable from what's that song? My Funny Valentine. Unphotographable. Right. He's unbiographable. Right. You can't write a biography about this guy because he has so confused the terrain. Right. Like, you have no idea where you're standing. So I want to start there. So what I argued is you got to break this down into three types of Philip Roth. All right. The first Roth is real Roth. All right, the guy who breathed air and loved baseball and ate knishes, whatever it might be, right? That's real Roth. I don't think we know very much about that guy, right? That guy is hidden behind 1,000 screens, and he didn't want to share, and that's his right.
Right, and a 900-page biography was published about him earlier this year, and it caused a lot of controversy for various reasons.
But the questions in that biography are really the questions that Roth asked about himself, right? I wanted to see different questions being asked, right?
Did you end up reading it?
Yeah, I did read it. Of course,
okay, I did not read it. Just
I did read it. Right. I read that biography and the Nadel biography. I preferred the Nadel biography by far. Right. I was surprised. Even in the Nadel biography, I thought there were lots of questions that interested Roth. Right. And as I said, Roth has such a clamp hold on our minds. Right. He's so controlling. I really wanted to ask questions that Roth never asked. Like, did he have labile personality disorder, right? Which would be, justifiable given that for 60 years he's writing about divided selves, right? Selves that transmogrify into other selves, right? Unstable personality. I think that's a good question. Anyhow, the three Roths. So there's real Roth. There's page Roth. There's Roth on the page, right? Real Roth we don't know enough about yet. Roth on the page is probably less misogynistic than people know because you have to read his entire canon of work, right? So I mentioned the death of the critic or the demise of the critic in the digital age. You have a lot of people that read one or two novels by Roth, right? And they either love it or hate it, and then they tweet about it, right? And then they write for Slate or whatever. Then they write about it, right? And for the professional Roth scholar, of which there are many, and many are quite good, it's like, oh, we've lost control of our narrative here, right? The people who are defining Philip Roth, right, don't know the body of work that he's produced. If you read Roth cover to cover, right, from the Box of Truths in 1952 to Nemesis in 2009, the charge of misogyny has some justification, but far less, I think, than his fiercest critics have made. Because there are a lot of really redeeming female characters in there, and there are a couple of good attempts to see the world from the point of view of one woman, right? Which I think, because those stories are so obscure, the 1962 The Good Girl being one of them, another one called Psychoanalytic Special, and In His Mistress's Voice, Roth was actually trying. At a certain point, it's like he was trying. I don't think he succeeded, but he made an honest effort that a lot of people don't know about because they're not familiar with the entire body of work. But then there's Nexus Roth. Nexus Roth is the Roth between the Roth who breathed and ate knishes and played baseball and the Roth on the page. And that he's a bad guy, right? I mean, like, he keeps taking these women's, right, the nexus. He keeps creating this nexus between things women did or said to him or around him. And he just like splays it onto the page. And the women are really upset, as we know from Claire Bloom, right? Or they start telling him, if you trust deception, I don't even know what that novel or thing is, right? They're like, don't write about me. You're going to destroy my marriage, right? If he's having an adulterous...
I mean, he just said the phrase trust deception. Deception is the title of one of his novels. Deception. I mean, how can we, it's right there. You can't trust deception to begin with, so...
Yeah, don't trust it. But having studied him for so long, my feeling is a lot of this stuff actually happened. A lot of these so-called fictional moments, right, are like real things that people said to him. A lot of them, not all of them, obviously. And it doesn't denigrate the product. It doesn't mean it's less worthy of art. But we need to understand that as critics. When I read Malamed's God's Grace, have you ever read that one?
No.
That's like end of cycle Malamed. It's about, you'll like this, it's about monkeys and apes on a spaceship reading Gemara, all right, reading Talmud. It's one of the straight... I don't think that came from his real life. All right? I just think Malamed was like, I have no fucks left to give. I've always wanted to write about monkeys in space, reading the Talmud, all right, and having a wise Jew teach him. It's a funny disaster. It's a hot mess, right? But you can't say the same thing about that novel that you can say about so many Roth novels, right? That it's coming from... Unless he was speaking to primates. I don't know, right? I doubt it.
And Roth did have especially a stretch after Portnoy where he had books that maybe had some autobiographical origin, but Our Gang, The Breast, and Great American Novel all have these extremely comic, bizarre aspects to it. Of The Breast was obviously of a paradigm metamorphosis where a man turns into a giant human breast and goes from there. Although that... Isn't that David Kepich given that name? Then he comes, and then 30 years later, he's in another novel, no longer a breast, and so
he's not quite the same guy either. We think, right? It's weird, right?
And then there's also multiple Nathan Zuckermans. The first time Zuckerman is mentioned, it's in a meta-literary way as a story or novel within the novel. It's
My Life as a Man, right? And then a different Zuckerman appears in 1979 in The Ghostwriter, right?
Yes.
Refurbished his Zuckerman, right? Shined him up.
And then in The Counterlife, you have multiple, it's like this, the parallel universe sort of thing going on. So it's hard to say what actually is happening here. And most other writers, it's sort of like, I guess it is somewhat akin to like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something. It's like there is this larger thing sort of unfolding over multiple works, whereas most other, obviously, like there are writers who, like the Rabbit books had, the same characters over time, but look at the oeuvre as a whole.
I quote you, I like what you said. It's hard to say what's happening here.
Right.
I taught Roth for 3 decades. I can't tell you how many times a student, has thrown up his or her hands. I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm standing. And my response is, groove with it, right? Go with it. It's good, right? You can't get this at the World Bank. You can't get this at Deloitte. All right. So enjoy these college years, right? And enjoy being completely destabilized and not knowing ontologically where you are. Because that's one of the great things about Philip Roth's art, right? He just trips you up. You have no idea what's happening. You have no idea what you're holding in your hand. And good for him, right? I really like that aspect of his literary aesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask, okay, so we were discussing the misogyny charge. Well, what about the 2 other related charges? Being a misanthrope and being misandrist. Misandrist is, the hating men. Mm-hmm. There's, you can make a pretty good case that Roth, illuminated the ways that men can behave badly better than, almost any other writer. Mm-hmm. And we sort of talked about this somewhat in our previous conversation. It's like Portnoy does a lot of bad stuff in his life. If if we're looking at like sort of the pluses and minuses of what he's done, including masturbating into his family's dinner, and at the end of the book, trying to sexually assault a woman who doesn't want to have sex with him, which is sort of played for comic effect in the book. But he is, this is you wouldn't want this to be your son, and you probably wouldn't want it to be your friend or your lover or anything. You want to stay away from this type of person. They seem pretty bad. There's a lot of very bad people, male and female, presented in the Roth novels. We are sort of given much more insight into why the male characters act as they do, and maybe we feel more sympathy to them because they are like either first person narrator or close third person, or just they're painted more vividly, so we take them warts and all or something, whereas the women are more cartoonish. But there's the scene, I'd like block this out because it's so bizarre, but the scene isn't from my life as a man, where the woman is lying on the ground and is saying kill me, and he has the poker, and then she soils herself. Like, this is everyone here is needs some therapy, or at least, and is acting very badly. So yeah, it's, I mean, do people, does this make sense to you? Like, yeah, he portrayed men being, very, very bad also. And even he tries to get into the mind of the concentration camp guard, Ivan the Terrible, whatever, and try to understand what that could be like. And in Operation Shylock. So is there a critical opinion on this angle?
He's certainly, I mean, that's great. That's what we love. Talk about speaking the unspeakable. We need that, right? We need to understand who these sorts of creeps are. The problem is that often it's not entirely clear that the moral balance of the story, right, or the moral arrow is pointing towards condemnation of these fellows. I think that's what some readers have great difficulty with. It doesn't seem like there's like this third person narrative voice, right, which Roth occasionally uses, which is like, can you believe this guy? I mean, oh my God, right? What did he say about Sabbath Theater? It was the most fun he ever had writing, and it was the best novel he ever wrote, and right? So he's enjoying that stuff.
He obviously enjoys transgressing, and that's a huge
transgressing, right?
Yeah, he enjoys that. I mean, but if you saw Mickey Sabbath walking down the street, you would turn it in the other direction. Like, you don't want to encounter Mickey Sabbath. Yeah. If there's sort of like this, the way that the contemporary, at least online discussion of art has become, is sort of like they want the creator to like come out at the end and be like, well, this person was bad and this person was good, and we all agree. And so, like, they want Shakespeare to come out at the end of Hamlet and be like, well, Hamlet was actually a pretty bad guy, and he caused 11 people's deaths, and like this was like any sort of ambiguity about morality. People seem to really, maybe that's why Marvel superhero movies are so popular now. It's like people, they want good versus evil or something more than they once did. And so, yeah, like Portnoy, entertaining, funny, wacky, and we sort of enjoy spending time with him, at least some of us do. But then you step back and say, oh yeah, he did a lot of bad stuff, and you wouldn't want him to be your friend.
Yeah, I've got no problem with it, right? I don't want to censor anyone. A lot of your general public does, right? And there is this censorious imperative to shut people down, to cancel them, right? But, I mean, I think cancellation, way too much is made of that. Nobody was trying to stop Roth from doing it. I mean, you raise a really good point, right? Literature, again, that first chapter, art is slimy. When I go into a work of art, right, which is a really serious thing for me because, like many people, I do it every day, right? When I turn on music, when I'm jogging and listening, I'm in that work of art. When I'm reading at night, I'm locked in. That's a term I like to use, as you are, right? Like, I'm all in, man, right? I mean, come on. I expect as part of the contract that I can be scandalized, nauseated, disgusted, right? I assume that is part of the contract I have with an artist. And I don't know if this generation wants that contract anymore, right? I don't know if they agree that should be part of one's artistic experience. They certainly, in some quarters, they're not crazy about it in college classrooms, right? If professors are assigning texts that students find insulting or disparaging to certain groups, And I get it though. Like, I mean, I understand those students who are like, well, why do we keep reading texts that keep doing this, right? Why does this canon keep the arrow again pointing in the direction of racism, right? Why does the canon keep pointing in the direction of misogyny? And that's really where the professor/critic is needed to conduct like a fair inquiry or autopsy of these materials, right? That's where you need the professor to say, okay, you're right, but here's what's good, right? Here's what's beautiful. Here's what's elegiac and lyrical about the work. Here's what's problematic and that we can discard. And here are the major questions, right, that we want to ask. Roth himself, quoting Chekhov, said the job of the writer is not to solve the problem. The job of the writer is to delineate the problem, all right? Tell us what the dilemma is. And with men, Roth did a pretty good job with that. Like, he showed us these men in their raw modalities: Oedipal rage, impotence, right? Lust, right? Just sexual carnal desire gone wild. He referred to preposterone. Remember that? Testosterone, preposterone. He said, he's really good at that, right? And this is why people read Roth. It's like you're getting the good stuff, right? You're really learning what these creeper men are like, and probably more men than we care to acknowledge. He managed to tap into that and put it on the page, but he doesn't get a free pass for that, right? He gets pushback. He can get pushback. He can have people criticizing him. That's part of the process. So I think it's all fair, right? I don't think an injustice was served to Philip Roth, winning all his prizes and dominating the American literary landscape with Updike as he did for decades, right? I mean, is anyone going to say, Philip Roth, man, that guy got a raw deal. He got a raw shake. Nobody's going to say that about Philip Roth. But I could name for you dozens of writers in the 80s who we don't know, who are great writers, right? Who, while all the attention was beamed on Philip Roth, right, were never even considered by our janky literary infrastructure, right? Because critics weren't doing their jobs either, right? They weren't looking for these other writers who were.
Yeah, and you would hope that there'd be some, what happened with, The Great Gatsby or Moby Dick, that over time things would be rediscovered and the prejudices of the day would fall away. I mean, it's just like, it's been 20 years since I was a college freshman. I'm thinking like, how would these things, how young people take this in? I mean, like if there's, and maybe this is just a caricature, if there's like, if there are students who are like, don't want to object to Crime and Punishment because, like, the main character kills a defenseless old woman. Like this is the kind of activity we're condoning in our great universities. Like that's like sort of the making fun of like woke students or something. But like, yeah, I don't know. It's I hope that things aren't moving in that direction. Or like
as a professor and teaching a lot of really, really scandalous, egregious stuff. I mean, I'm really attracted to that sort of material, right? I've rarely encountered students like that. Usually when you see a campus shitstorm, there's a history there, right? And I don't want to blame the professor, but there's often a professor that's got like a track record of doing this and not listening to students, right? Students are really respectful of their professors, I find, and they're going to listen, right? They'll argue with you, but it's rare in my experience that students are hitting that red cancel button immediately, right? They want the professor, whoever she or he is, to make the case. Kids, all right, we're reading Huckleberry Finn because, all right? We're reading Othello because. We're reading Portnoy's Complaint because. There's something here for you in spite of X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And I think a good professor, a seasoned professor, right, knows how to, you never hear about them, right? We're the ones that don't make the news cycle because we haven't had a revolt in our classroom, right? And as Stanley Crouch once said, the students' boots aren't on the president's desk of the university because there's been a protest about us, right? So I feel, again, we do this for writers, right? We're happy to do it for you writers of the world. We're happy to read you, right? And make the best imaginable case for your creation. And this is really what professors of literature do day in, day out. And I think they do it well in many cases when they're not off on their own political agendas, right? When they're just trying to help students, undergraduates understand what's going on. That's a very powerful process.
Yeah. And I've been discussing this sort of topic of like campus incidents, like, there's 5,000 undergraduate, campuses in the country and millions of students, and something weird is happening on every single one of them every day. And if you have a smartphone, you can record it, and it goes viral or something. So I think a lot of that stuff is overblown. Maybe we've kind of been going long already, but let's talk at least a little bit about like sort of the second half of the book, Roth Unsexed, you call it. I guess there was Prometheus Bound, and then there was Zuckerman Unbound, and then there was Zuckerman Bound, the collected edition of the Zuckerman stuff. So here's Roth Unsexed. And so you talk about, things that, some themes, and like, I can't remember if we've stated this explicitly. You read the entire corpus of Roth, including all the uncollected short stories. I've not read those ones as part of your studies. And so you're looking for themes that maybe other, obviously like Roth's treatment of women is a surface theme, but you've identified some that maybe fewer people have noticed. And one of them is sort of like the self and how Roth conceives of the self, and almost possibly he arises of some sort of like a Buddhist idea of like the self doesn't even truly exist, or how is the self, or maybe it's more of like a sociological construction of the self from various conflicting identities and interactions with other people. That is I think you make a compelling case that this is a theme that should be studied more. And you also talk about how he often has a lot of characters who have some sudden change in their life, like turning into a breast, or Mary from American Pastoral. She's a normal girl, then suddenly she's a terrorist.
What about collective change? Like the United States flips and becomes Nazified, right?
Right. And so
everything's changing in this.
Flag is America. Yeah. So, So can you talk a little bit more about these broad areas?
So some scholars have written about this, right? I don't think they drew the threads together, right? I'm certainly not the first. Even Roth said, I write about vivid transformation. That's one of the few times I agree with Roth being his own literary critic. Yeah, he nailed it. He writes about vivid transformation. So my question was, what is he telling us about the self, right? Because he keeps talking about selves that are undergoing these radical mutations, right? It could be metamorphosis, but it could, Aryeh, be metempsychosis. Oh, wow. That was like the cool part of the research was going back to Proust and James Joyce, because this was a thing, right? And metempsychosis is like the transmigration of souls. And you're saying, wait a second, Roth is a secular Jew. He doesn't believe in all that, mumbo jumbo. I don't know. It keeps happening in his work.
Can you define metempsychosis a little bit more? It's sort of like maybe the soul is eternal and exists before and after.
It departs from one body, right, and goes to, it's like this ancient esoteric doctrine from the time of the Church Fathers, right? It goes from one body and it just enters another body. And you see this in Jinx Pizesky in Sabbath's Theater, for example. So it's almost as if, now Roth didn't fully understand metempsychosis. He botched it a little bit. That's fine, all right? But the idea is that your physical body gets like taken over or invaded by a completely different persona and a completely different self, right? This is one of his many species of transformation narratives, right? So who are some people that this happened to in his fiction? We can work together on this, right? Jinx Pizesky is a very good example. It goes from a born-again Christian, remember that, right, to a kind of Mansonite, like a follower of Charles Manson, right? Mary Levov, right? It goes from the ballet student, right, to daddy's little girl, to a terrorist, to a Jane, Jain, right? So Roth uses the term metempsychosis. I became very, very interested, and it's part of this larger Rothian preoccupation with people in radical flux. So I had a nifty little line. Everyone says he's interested in fucking, but he's interested in fluxing, all right? That's his thing, all right? Flux, 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 movement, people changing. Look how quiet Zuckerman gets, right, in the American trilogy. It's like he's like shut his yapper, right? This guy couldn't stop talking in the anatomy lesson, right? He had to have his jaw broken to stop talking. He talks so much, right? Right. And all of a sudden he's quiet. So Roth is interested in natural and supernatural changes of ourself. So that's one interesting thing. Another interesting chapter I found was about Roth's idea that there's no such thing as a stable, coherent self. These two are intimately linked, these two ideas, right? I recognized, having a degree in sociology, like my secret doctorate is in theoretical sociology, I was like, oh my God, he's grafting this from Irving Goffman, right, and the symbolic interactionist school, right, and Bloomer, and there are all these figures that write about the sociological notion that Aryeh's self has nothing to do with you. right? You are a creation of the world around you. And I started seeing like this textbook version of this in Letting Go and in The Counterlife. It was like he took it right off the page, right, from the symbolic interactionist. So what does Roth believe? That the self is a social construct. It is not unchanging. It has no fundamental essence, and it is mutable. It can become anything, right? It can change into any. That means you are you, right? If Philip Roth were our life coach, right? You could be a priest, young man, all right? You could be a member of the NYPD. There's so many things. You could be a pole vaulter, right? There's so many things you could do. Think about the humbling. At the end of his career, have you read it recently?
I read it when it was released, and that was the last time I read it.
He's writing about people that are changing their sexual orientation, right? And it's not like he was into trans issues. I assure you he wasn't, right? But when I read it, I was like, oh, Roth is fascinated by this, right? This fascinates him because a change of gender to Roth, right? That's a massive change. So he has two characters in there that are radically changing their idea of whether they are men or whether they are women. So there's change everywhere. He invokes Rilke. The great work of art says, you must change. And I wonder if Roth wants us to read him. I'm just speculating, right? Just spitballing here after 30 years of teaching the guy. I'm just spitballing. But what if Roth's project for the reader was to get you to embrace change, think about change, understand change, and change, right? Like, go with it, man. Like, crack out the bong, right? Or whatever, the shrooms, right? And just become the opposite of what you are, right? If you want to become a breast, you can become a breast. That's cool, right? He's given you many, many different options. So I think that's really nice about Roth. And it's not all sexed up, and it's not like politically hazardous. And young students like that because they don't like my generation's fixedness. You know, you work at the same job for 30 years, you have change. They don't like that, right? They want to change jobs every 2 years. So that appeals to them because they see this writer talking about radical constant change, right? Altering the self. So I think that's really beautiful about Roth, and, you know, God bless him. I mean, I want us to also focus on that when we talk about his legacy and his posterity. Mm-hmm.
And so, so at the end of the breast, it is printed. Is it in English or in German?
He had it. No, it's in English.
Okay, it's the archaic torso of Apollo, or whatever, that Rilke poem that ends, "You must change your life," and that's the final. I think that must be the only time he pulls a trick like that of ending a novel with someone else's poem. But yes, that's the final line. I think that was my first when I read The Breast. I think I was still in college, and I probably didn't even know who Rilke was, and so that was the first time I encountered that poem. And I was very mystified by that. I mean, it's a very strange novel overall, but yeah, so that "You Must Change Your Life" is, definitely a theme there. But I have a prop here, and this is my one question for you that you did not include, which is, here is one collection, Roth's collection of nonfiction, "Reading Myself and Others." Is this another? Is he joking? Is there no myself? And why clearly, this is a man who thinks about words very carefully.
A strong conception of the self, right? I don't know. I wanted a biographer to figure out what's going on psychologically, not in terms of Oedipal issues. Like, did he have this very weakened sense of his self, and did it attack him and gnaw at him, and then he broke out at some point and said, "Screw it, I'm no one thing," right? Remember when Sartre said, "Man is a no thing, man is nothing," right? Man is a no thing, nothing. Uh-huh. I feel Roth was reading existentialists at Bucknell and University of Chicago, right? And he just liked this idea, and he kind of popularized it. He doesn't take a deep dive, right, on symbolic interactionism or existentialist themes, right? But he was reading this. And look, this is a great question for you. It's a great question for me, for my kids, for the students I teach, right? Because we are going to change. It's like a fundamental truth, right? We are really going to change. Roth can be your Sherpa, right? Roth can guide you through different types of change experiences. Now, my friend, we have a legacy for Philip, I feel, right? Once we get out of the sexual politics, right, the misogyny, where I think the charge is somewhat justified, right? If I can hit the next generation, so read him as a change writer, right? Here's the canon. Read him as a guy who writes about radical change. Let's leave aside. Maybe we can imagine a path forward for Roth. Not that he needs it. He has received all the acclaim, all the fame, all the honor that he should and he deserves, probably more, right? But it would be nice for those of us invested in Roth studies to see him kind of extend for a century or 2 centuries or so. That would be nice.
Okay, let's. So there's other stuff you cover, but we're going a little long, and so people should check out the book. I'm holding up to the camera once again, but I do want to ask you about the biography mess and the Blake Bailey stuff. And I know you're a member of the Philip Roth Society or an editor of the Quarterly or something, but you at one point signed a letter that was to whatever trust is or why don't you just summarize this about holding on to the papers that maybe were going to be destroyed? And
Yeah. So my colleague, thank you, Amy Pozorski, who's the editor of Philip Roth Studies, and we did this all through text. It happened on this here phone, right? I was nervous about something I heard. You can see me mention it on page 15 or 16 in the book, where I'm like, did Roth just say that he's going to have all his papers burned after Blake Bailey tells the correct version, right? He did say that. He did, right? And then I locked it away. And then came the scandal. And if you read Mark Oppenheimer's piece, where I'm the only negative voice there.
Oh, I forgot that you, okay. I didn't realize you were quoted in that.
Love fest in a way. I don't know what was going on there. And there's one.
Oppenheimer wrote a profile of Bailey for the New York Times Magazine that came out within a week of the, talk about bad timing, of the allegations breaking into the press.
And there's one turd in the punch bowl, and his name is Berlinerblau, right? And I get one sentence. I'm like, this is not good. I don't like this, right? I don't think this is a good scholarship. Doesn't work when one person gets to see an archive and then it's burned, right? I can't believe, honestly, I can't believe he agreed to that, right? Bailey, it's just, I would not agree to that, right?
This is, we're starting to question how ethical this Bailey fellow really is.
This happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Same thing, right? Where just certain amounts of people were allowed to look at it, and then somebody just pirated them, threw them online, and that ended that, right? Okay, so what do we know? We know there's from the Oppenheimer piece, we know there's a tremendous stash of letters. All right, this is important, right? In the Library of Congress, just give me a second here. This is going to be worth it, all right? True knowledge is coming your way, right? In the Library of Congress, 90% of the correspondences are people writing to Philip Roth. It's not Philip Roth. They're writing back to him. 5% of them do we get to see what Roth wrote to them. Right? I think that's a weird thing about the Library of Congress archive, which I've perused, right? So
he wasn't keeping copies necessarily of the letters that he wrote to someone, but he was keeping a copy of.
Yeah, unless that's what the official biographer was given. The official biographer he also had the benefit of Roth telling his friends, send that thing to him, right? So Oppenheimer makes a reference to an attic in which there are cabinets, 6 cabinets full of Roth materials, right? It's not clear if that's the same stash of materials that Roth wanted to be burned. So what Amy Pozorski and I did is we put a body block down, right? And luckily the New York Times and Alexandra Alter picked it up. And we said, no, don't do this. This is a really, really bad idea. Roth's literary executors, whoever they are, well, we know who they are right now. Is anyone going to listen to us? I don't know. Is it the end of the world if they get burnt? No. I mean, as Baheshevich Singer said, a child did not die. So we have to have a sense of perspective about this, but I don't like what it signifies, right? So we have this stash of materials, and now it's going to go up in flame because Roth didn't want us to see it. I think what Roth misunderstood, we'd probably like him more if we read that stuff, right? I mean, we couldn't like him less. I mean, he's got so many critics, right? If we hear him in his own voice and we hear people who knew him talking about him, I just think it's going to be more positive. So that's a real problem. I don't know what the status of that is. I know that his people, his literary estate, are very defensive and they're very litigious, right? So I'm not hopeful, but if enough people care about it, it'll become an issue. But they might have been burned for all we know. Or the official biographer might be holding on to this stuff and saying it's mine. How do they get it back from the official? It might be sitting in an attic right now. Mystery.
Okay, wow. So this is dramatic stuff at least within this world of literary estates and so forth. It is, a strange, unusual request to begin with, and then once you factor in that the only outsider who had access to all the stuff has been accused of, multiple rapes by women, and seems, in my layman's opinion, to be some sort of sociopath, because he is accused of raping a woman in the house of the New York Times book critic. That's to do that is beyond sort of normal levels of criminality. That would be sort of, we're talking to Kepesh and Mickey Sabbath level of sociopathy to try to do something that horrible. So it just like, maybe because, I mean, I guess it sort of in a way gets back to the idea of, people who interact with a writer, like what's the ethics of exposing their lives to the public in some way. Maybe you wait 25 years or something before opening it all up, so most of these people are gone. But it seems like it, history and literary history and deserves better than Blake Bailey being the final arbiter of this stuff. And maybe you wait 100 years. I mean, they said they sealed Prince Philip's will for 90 years. So who knows what's in there, but we're not going to find out.
One thing, I mean, did Roth inadvertently self-cancel himself, right? By creating this incredible process through which only one person would look at his... It's almost as if he participated in the very opposite. There's an expression in French, quand on joue, on est joué. When we play, we are played. Right. And I feel Roth was playing, and he got exactly as Laura Marsh said, right? It backfired, right? Spectacularly.
Right. Well, if let's say that, on the transmigration of souls, that Philip Roth, the entity, is still out there in some alternate dimension or something. Do you think he's laughing at all this? Because it almost seems like something he could have, like, who could have come up with this crazy scenario? It almost seems like Philip Roth. And also, what do you think? Some people have said that, the fact that Roth handpicked Bailey, and there was this, tumultuous thing with like firing and threatening to sue various other previous authorized biographers. The fact that he felt this affinity with Bailey, who is accused of being a rapist, is unfair or not? Does that cast some light back on Roth the man?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, the amount of trust he invested in this person, right? And remember, a writer's job is to observe people, right? I think Tom Wolfe is the great, like, nothing gets past Tom Wolfe, right? I feel Tom Wolfe never gets his due for a variety of reasons, right? So Tom Wolfe, if he were to look at me, I'd be scared, right? Like, he'd just break me down. But that's what writers do. That's what Saul Bellow did, right? They look at people and they understand how Roth couldn't have looked, at this person and made... it just made some fundamental judgments. It's just very, very strange to me, right?
Well, it's often said about sociopaths that they're very charming and they are able to wiggle their way into various people's lives because they just seem to have this quality, which at first people are like, oh, this is a great guy and they're so friendly and everything. And then, maybe it all goes bad or something. So maybe this is too facile, but also he was, in his 70s, at least when he first met Bailey, I guess. So it's possible the writing declined over time, I think, and maybe his faculty of seeing through bullshit or whatever also sort of declined. And obviously, Bailey, as someone who would like flatter him, it seems like Bailey had that skill and he used it.
But everyone flattered him.
Get in with Roth, but also he used it to, like, when he was teaching, middle school students, he would flatter these children, and years later he would like try to have sex with them. So that's hideous. But
allegedly, I mean,
allegedly.
Let's say so. But remember, Roth's circle. Like, there are 8 books written by Roth about Roth by his friends. I mean, nobody can make that claim. That's a bizarre claim. There are almost as many books written by Roth by his friends as are by scholars, right? It might be like 20 to 8 or 19 to 8, right? Mm-hmm. It's the kind of Jerry Sandusky problem, right? I mean, Joe Paterno and, Pa, whatever his name is, Joe Pa, right? They're all surrounded there at Penn State, right? There's a bubble. Nobody can get in. Right. And when there's no critic or regulatory mechanism, I don't want to sound like too much of a liberal, right? Secular state, right? When nobody's looking, these types of things are going to happen, right? And I'm not saying Roth intended for this to happen, but he increasingly surrounded himself with friends and confidants. And I don't think he had enough, shall we say, critical pushback from people, right? I mean, I have people like that in my life. I mean, my wife, right? I mean, that's the role she plays, is to my friends. They criticize me. You have folks like that. My mother, right? And I do it for them as well, right? That's our job. Our job is to call bullshit on one another.
Right.
And I think when you become famous for obvious reasons, it's hard to find people like that, right? That are willing to
Yeah,
say,
who's willing to call you on your bullshit? Yeah, that's a valuable person to have in your life. And Roth, was married twice, but one marriage was like this very like 15-year relationship, and then 2-year marriage, and then it all ended in disaster. So it did seem like he largely led a solitary life, laid out. Although you would also hear that he would come to New York all the time and entertain and have dinner parties or attend dinner parties or something. But yeah, I mean, it's just if someone reaches that stature, they are that age. This is the guy who never got the Nobel Prize unfairly. It is difficult to imagine someone in his circle calling bullshit or telling him he's wrong about everything. And Roth was not the type of person who seemed to like being told that they're wrong. Most people don't. Sort of in a more evil register, it played out in the Trump administration. Like the people surrounded Trump, no one was willing to really call him out or withstand his fury and stand up to him. They all shrank away and didn't show a lot of moral courage. It does seem like Bailey really was skilled at manipulating people, and Roth was, he manipulated him as well.
It could be, though Roth went in search of these. This was his project for the last 25 years of his life, right? So at some point, Roth was thinking very hard about Bailey and his appropriateness for the job. It's curious, right? It's really curious. A colossal act of misjudgment by a person who was really good in real life, right? Roth was a player, right? He knew how to manage his affairs and fight for his interests, right? He was good. That was a misjudgment, and a big one. And what can we say?
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see if this does affect the legacy, like popularly, if people are like, oh, isn't that the guy who his biographer turned out to be and accused multiple rapist? That's a black mark. That's not a feather in the cap, to use the catch-22 dichotomy. But it's still a huge mess. It's obviously calmed down, but I do wonder what will happen. Yeah, and especially the documents, and it seems insane to me that the literary executors would be stoking the fire right now. I think they would be smart to just say, okay, we'll wait 20 years and then reassess all this stuff. But it's totally bizarre. And do you think is the ghost of Philip Roth, the ghostwriter, is he chuckling at this ridiculousness, or what do you think?
I don't know, because as my colleague said, he's unbiographical. I still don't know the guy, right? I might be in the top 1% of people in the world who know Philip Roth. I don't know him. I don't know how he really felt about it. I don't know what the unguarded Philip Roth is. I'm trying to know him in the text, and I hope the next generation can figure it out. I really do wonder what he would make of this book, right? I'm
guessing he wouldn't like it because he just seemed to not like his critics to begin with.
Exactly. But I kind of think, I'd like to think there's a part of him that'd be, that Berlinerblau, right? Thumbs up, kid, and a little pat on the back. Attaboy, because I'm doing the Roth thing, right? And the Roth thing is like this relentless criticism, a dislike of pastorals, right? A hatred of hypocrisy. That's what I'm trying to do, right? Am I hypocritical? Absolutely. Do I have my own pastorals? Yes. And that's where my wife and my mom and my friends come in to call me on it, right? But Roth taught us that, and he probably taught you that, right? And I guess we have to live by this Rothian ethos, right, of keeping it real and really telling the truth and being damned, right? Just tell the truth and be damned. And I feel Roth, if we can say a really great thing about him, I do believe he believed that, right? And he wanted the world to know the importance of independent, right, non-compromised voices telling us what the world is like. And that's his greatness. And let's try to preserve that, at least.
Yeah, that sounds a good place to end it. But of course, I'm thinking, the classic Roth thing is you have like the thesis and antithesis or antithesis coming together. And, the guy who wanted to tell the truth, of course, he meticulously stage managed his public presence and handpicked his own biographer, and the documents are going to be destroyed. So, they're both impulses are there of telling the total truth and then only presenting the exact thing that he meticulously arranged to be his legacy. So a complicated man, we could say. Anything else do you want to hit before we wrap up?
No, I'm really interested. The folks that are interested are people who love books and love culture, such as yourself, right? One thing that interests me is the literary world going to read this book and understand the indictment that is leveled and deal with it? My surmise is no, right? They're not going to deal with what the accusations are, right? But I'm really grateful for shows like this. I know this is a small show with a growing audience, and there are a few shows like this. These are people that really care about culture, and you guys care about books, and you want to talk about ideas. So thank you. That's really what I want to say. Thank you for taking it seriously, and I hope you'll have me again when I get into more trouble about something else.
Well, yeah, thank you for coming on. Thank you for the book. If you are a Philip Roth fan, this is one you want to check out. And if you're still somehow listening or watching this and you're not interested in Philip Roth, I'm not quite sure what you're doing with your day. But so the Philip Roth We Don't Know, Sex, Race, and Autobiography is the title. And yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap up. So do you want anything else, website or a Twitter feed or anything else you want to mention?
Oh, sure.
People want to follow you?
I write about a lot of things. I write about secularism in particular. So jberlinerblau.com, if you want to see all of my meshugas, if you will, is there. And on Twitter, it's just @Berlinerblau. And once again, Aryeh, thank you so much for having me today.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation, and thanks to our viewers and listeners who can, rate, review, do whatever they want. It's, it's up to them.
Kid. Come at me.
Yeah, and tell us, and if you think we're wrong, sound off in the comments. Okay, so thank you once again, Jacques, and thanks to everyone else, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.